Welcome to DIYEasyCrafts.com. Today we're going to take a look at why you need a 2x72 belt grinder to be a knife maker. Now, having said that, it's not absolutely mandatory. Certainly people make knives by cutting them out with hacksaws, using a disc grinder, or even doing the bevels with a file. What I'm talking about is if you're really going to become serious as a knife maker, why the 2x72 belt grinder has really become the quintessential knife making tool. So let's start with profiling a blade. The 2x72, mine is an OBM Origin blade maker 2x72. It's got a 2 horsepower variable speed, and it works fantastic with a 90-degree work rest for profiling blades. You know, this one was cut to a rough size, but you could actually just shape the entire blade right on the belt grinder with a coarse grit belt. You can even run that belt a little bit over one edge so that you can get and round over those inside curves. You can see how quick and easy it is just to completely follow the line, the scribed line, or in this case it's a marker line indicating the outline or the profile of the blade. In fact, with this grinder, you could, except for maybe drilling the pinholes and hardening it, you could make an entire knife. It really is the go-to machine for the knife maker. Now, most people think about bevels when you start to talk to them about grinders, and a 2x72 is awesome for beveling knives. It's mounted up. I've got a tilt table work rest mounted up to the 2x72. This creates just a nice solid platform, and I'm grinding a flat bevel. Flat bevels are done with a flat platen, which comes standard with most belt grinders. You could certainly do this freehand. You could do it with a different type of bevel jig. I happen to be very partial to this tilt table. It's just a very easy way of creating really, really nice bevels. Very controllable. All right, so now we've got the blade profiled and we put a bevel on it. Aside from flat bevels, it's very easy to transform this machine or change the flat platen over into a large contact wheel. In this case, it's a 10-inch contact wheel for doing hollow grinds. Now, whenever you're doing bevels, it's really nice to use a coarse grit belt to start, remove the majority of the material with a coarse grit belt, and then switch to a finer grit. The coarse grit belts not only remove material a lot faster, but they also generate a lot less heat than the fine grit belts do. So now I've set up the same tilt table work rest in order to do hollow grinds on a 10-inch large wheel. And this really becomes as easy as just guiding the blade across the large wheel while keeping an eye on the centerline scribes on the side of the blade. It really makes hollow grinds very, very easy. Now, aside from flat bevels and hollow grinds, you can also use the grinder just to create flat bevels, full flat bevels, like on a chef's knife. When I do that, I use a 90-degree work table as a guide, as a rest. And then just slowly go back and forth. I establish a bevel, and then I just chase that bevel ridge all the way until it reaches the spine of the knife. Now, Before you bevel a blade, and certainly after you harden the blade, it's always good to confirm that the blank is flat. And one way of doing that is just with a handled magnet, a shop magnet, on the flat platen of the 2x72. It's just a very crude way of surface grinding. And of course, you can go through the belts. You can start with a coarse grit and move to a finer grit if you want a better finish. Another way of doing that same process is with a surface grinding attachment to the 2x72. Now this is Oregon or Origin Blade Maker's surface grinding attachment, and I did a whole separate video on this. But it's a really neat attachment. The blade actually gets held in place by magnets on a gliding rail, and then there's a knob that you can turn that adjusts or moves that rail in or out away from the contact wheel. So basically, once you get it all set up, you slide that rail up and down, removing material from one side or one surface of the knife blank. And it only takes a few passes. And usually do this before beveling, and certainly after you heat treat the knife, after the rough bevels are done, and you heat treat the knife, just to confirm that it's still flat, or to reestablish that the blade is flat. Another thing that you can do, also on the flat platen and also with that same handled shop magnet, is to mirror polish a blade without any hand sanding. And the way you do this is to go through the belts from 120, 240, 400, 800, 1200, all the way up to 2000 grit. And you also alternate the angle that you're holding the blade. I did another video on this, and you can certainly check that out on the playlist. But very quickly and fairly easily, you can obtain a decent mirror finish without any hand sanding. The final touch is to change the belt to a felt belt. Use a little bit of compound and just finish polishing on that felt belt. And anybody that's hand polished a knife to a mirror finish will really appreciate this. Nice mirror finish, straight off the 2x72 grinder. Now as we start to put the knife together, some knives are going to use bolsters. I happen to like to use that same 10-inch contact wheel in order to shape and then polish the front surface of the bolster. So once the bolster is in place on the knife, that front edge is impossible to sand or to polish. So you always really want to sand those progressively from a coarse grit to shape it down to a finer grit to give it a better finish, and then to buff it before you mount the bolsters onto the blade. So I'm going through this, I think, is a 220 grit. I'll probably go to 400 or 800 grit before I'll polish. And once you establish the shape with the coarser grit, then each progressive belt is very quick. It's just a few passes, and then another belt change. I'm going to finish these up also on the felt belt with a little bit of the polishing compound. And this saves me from ever having to go to a buffing wheel. In fact, if you didn't have a buffing wheel, you could do the bolsters complete right on the 2x72. And you get a nice mirror finish on the front edge of those brass bolsters. I also use the 2x72 on a flat platen just to establish that scales, my handles or scales, are flat on the one edge. Some material, especially like buffalo horn, you always have to establish that it's flat. These scales have turquoise, and they're a little bit difficult in order to sand down. Um, but I just cranked up the 2x72 RPMs a little bit, and it really went right through it. Now, once the bolsters and the handles are attached to the knife, you can go back to the 2x72. In this case, I'm using a 90-degree work rest, and I'm just profiling the handles and the bolsters. Now you can clean up the spine of the blade vertically on the same flat platen with a finer grit belt. So when you're on the 90-degree table, the grind lines were going perpendicular to the blade, and now you're going to basically grind those all the way or sand those all the way with a finer grit belt vertically. The scales on the left side of this knife are a little bit too thick. I'm going to use the same flat platen to thin out the scales, and at the same time I'm going to grind down the brass pins that have been keened over, holding the bolsters in place. So I'm holding the scales flat to the flat platen. I'm keeping an eye on it so that it is square, looking down the top of the blade. Quenching it in water every few seconds. I really don't want the pins to become too hot. Doesn't make that much of a difference with wood scales, but when you're using some of the aluminite scales or plastic scales, you can actually melt the scale material or damage it if the pins get too hot. Now to clean up the inside, especially the curvature, little small curves, we're using a small wheel attachment on the 2x72. In the past, I've done this with a Dremel grinder. It just takes forever. So the small wheel attachment is really a nice addition. You do have to slow down the RPMs to save the bearings, but you can run through the same coarser grit belts down to a finer grit belt like a 240 or a 400 in order to get a nice finish on the inside of that tang. Now, if you don't have a buffing wheel, and actually sometimes even if you do have a buffing wheel, it's nice to use a felt belt on the 2x72. I'm using it with a little bit of polishing compound to polish not only the scales, but also the brass bolsters on this chef's knife. These are aluminite scales with turquoise embedded in them. So wood burl and turquoise. But the felt belt does a pretty nice job of polishing not only the aluminite, but also the brass. Now, I also sharpen my knives right on the 2x72. Some people do this on different surfaces, on a slack portion of the belt. I happen to do it on the flat platen. And to establish that micro bevel, I'll start with a 120 grit belt, and I'll just hold it at the right angle, make a slow pass. And basically, I also did another entire video on sharpening knives, but you want to establish a burr um, from one side to the other, and then once you have that burr along the entire edge of the blade, you change the belt and you move to a finer grit belt. And you keep changing until you're almost at a 2000 grit. The final step is to put a leather stroping belt on. Some people will use this under power. I don't. I just use the 2x72's flat platen to hold that leather belt in place, and then I give it a couple of passes on the leather stroping belt, and very quickly end up with a razor sharp knife that you can shave with. So we've profiled the shape of a blade, we've put bevels on the blades, we've um, shaped the handles, etc. In addition to that, I also used my 2x72 to shape and to finish a lot of the leather work that I do. I make no claims of being an expert sheath leather maker, but the grinder certainly comes in handy. And you can use a coarse grit. You remove a lot of material very quickly from that leather. And then when you move to the finer grits, it really almost polishes the leather. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the show and realize how important that 2x72 grinder is in any knife shop. If you are interested in producing good quality knives, it really is the machine to have. I hope you enjoyed this show. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this YouTube channel. By all means, check us out on the web at DIYEasyCrafts.com. You can check out my blades at www.bergknifemaking.com. And I would also like to invite you to join us, Jason Northgard and I, on our Facebook group, Knives and Knife Making. One additional thing that I'd like you to take a look at, if you want additional information on how to make knives, Jason and I just put out a book called Introduction to Knife Making. And it's the Beginner's Do-It-Yourself Guide to Making Knives. This can be found on Amazon.com. Thank you very much.